Part 5. The First Israel-Palestine War of 1948 and the Nakba.
In the whole period of British Mandatory Palestine, as Jews settled in unoccupied lands, it was the Arabs who during the first revolts forced certain Jewish communities to leave their homes as the Arabs took them over. This was specifically the Jewish communities which have always been there from centuries to thousands of years, such as in Hebron. Jews occupied areas they have always been in and never left, alongside new homes they built in lands the Arabs thought to be uninhabitable, and also homes and land they bought from vacant landlords living in other regions outside of British Mandatory Palestine. There was not one community at this time which was Jewish, nor any land all the way up until 1967 which the Jews lived in, which was as a result of forcing Palestinian Arabs or any other Arabs from the homes. When it came to the day in 1948 when the State of Israel and the separate State of Palestine was to be formalized, where the Arabs again refused the decree by the UN to a two-state solution, and in contrast again the Israelis accepted, and despite the pleas from the Zionists for all Arabs to remain in the land and coexist with equal rights, citizenship and opportunity, the Arab legions of Palestine, along with Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, Yemen and Iraq, all invaded the 24-hour-old reformed state of Israel and began the 1948 Palestine-Israel War, in the pursuit to kill the Jews and declare the land all an Islamic state. Again, just like after the Peel Commission proposal of a two-state solution, in where the Arab Palestinians rejected it, and instead of coming to the table with the Jews on discussions of an alternative solution, they simply refused and continued the violence of the Arab-Jew civil war from 1936 to 1939. Similar occurred here. A proposal decreed to end the conflict and grant a two-state solution so both sides have sovereignty in their own right. The Arab Palestinians, along with surrounding Arab legions, didn't look to just reject the proposal and come to the table with diplomatic alternatives which didn't include the death or exile of most of the Jews to stop the conflict. They waged war. The British, in an unprecedented fashion, instead of handing over mandatory powers, assets and recourse to Israel and Palestine to represent the two-state solution, they handed over nothing which didn't help anything. Instead, within a year of the war beginning, they took all their staff and left the land. This meant that Israel, along with Palestine, didn't officially exist and only existed if they self-declared their states and then were recognized by the majority of the rest of the world. It was as if the British gave up despite that they were decreed to hand over powers by the UN, and instead left saying in essence, fight it out amongst yourselves. An Arab victory was the expected outcome of the 1948 war waged against Israel. But to the world's surprise, despite Israel being so small in comparison with next to no foreign support, Israel won the war and pushed all the Arab forces back. Israel took occupancy of the region decreed to them by the UN and slightly more. The reason they took occupancy of more was to push the opposing forces back to a line of terrain covered in hills and mountains to serve as a natural enhanced border of protection to Israel. It meant from this point it was extremely hard for Arab forces at many points of the border to be able to effectively invade or send rockets over without Israel having warning. These borders are called the Green Line, and were borders agreed upon by all parties, Israel, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, Egypt and the UN at the end of the war. This is called the 1949 Armistice Agreement. This agreement shows all Arab countries and the UN unofficially recognizing Israel as a country and a Jewish state, since it wasn't technically legally recognized prior due to the British not formally passing over the mandatory assets. However, the Armistice Agreements specifically state that this is not to be taken as a final resolution of acceptance from all Arab parties involved regarding the Israel-Palestine dispute, and so the Green Line is a military line rather than a legal country border. This green line left the regions we recognize today as Gaza and Judea and Samaria, otherwise known as the West Bank, undisturbed. The Palestinian Arabs who already lived in these regions still remained, and many other Palestinian Arabs who both voluntarily left and those forced to leave the area that was now once again Israel, moved to and built homes within these regions. Throughout the war, hundreds of thousands of Arabs and Jews were displaced from homes they had in most parts occupied for decades to centuries. It was a regular story throughout the conflict of Jews being removed from their homes, specifically in East Jerusalem, where most of the Jews from there were forced to flee to other lands, such as areas within the Green Line of Israel, and Arabs who fought against Israel being forced to leave their homes to seek refuge past the Green Line. This resulted in more than 450,000 Arab refugees leaving past the Green Line. There are some who wrongfully state this was over 1 million. However, as stated in part 4, a large amount of Arabs left without force prior to the war, despite the Jews asking them to stay and live in peace. So adding these numbers to the 450,000 would equate to over 700,000. It is also key to note that of these 450,000 who left as a result of the war, not prior or during the start of it, it is estimated only half of these were forced to leave by the Jews. The other half mixed between those who voluntarily left, not wanting to live in a Jewish state, and those ordered to leave by their Arab leaders, many of which being forced to leave by their Arab leaders. The ones forced to leave by the Jews were because the Jews found those communities to be complicit in the encouragement and action of the war being waged on them. It should also be noted that a similar number of Arabs who were forced to leave the land of Israel remained and were granted citizenship and equal rights matching to what Israel proposed in their plea to the people prior to avoid the war. As mentioned in previous episodes, many Jews were displaced from their homes prior to the war from the surrounding Arab regions, which includes the regions which joined the war against Israel, and also many were displaced during the war. As a result of the war, all the Allied Arab regions increased their efforts to ethnically cleanse their populations, which resulted in over this period of altogether over 1.2 million Jews becoming refugees, 900,000 of which being forced to flee during and directly after the war. Many sought shelter in Israel, whereas others found new homes in other lands. To this day, there are more or less 0 Jews in Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, and Iraq. And where Iran surprisingly still have a population of Jews, it is less than 2% than what there were previously, even compared to as late as the start of the 1980s. From the start of the 20th century, there are hundreds of thousands to millions of Jews across these areas. Now these Arab regions successfully ethnically cleansed their lands of Jews. The Arabs losing the war and displacement of Arabs from Israel was called the Nakba by the Arabs, meaning catastrophe. Most nowadays believe the Nakba represents simply the displacement of the Palestinian Arabs, but the word doesn't necessarily mean that. Its alternative meaning by many at the time is that the catastrophe was that all these Arab legions joined forces, waged war on a tiny country who had no support from anyone else except Czechoslovakia, which was by way of selling them weapons, and not just lost, but came out of it with even less than what they started with. Such is the result of most wars when you lose. This was the catastrophe to them. Where displacing people as a result of war is never nice, it was done on both sides, with more Jews being displaced after the war and as a result of it, than Arabs. As stated, not all the Palestinian Arabs were forcibly displaced. Only those associated to the communities who were complicit in the war against the Jews. To this day, 20% of Israel's population is made up of Muslim Arabs. Bizarrely enough, despite the UN decreeing the land to become split as 2 sovereign states, a Jewish state and a Muslim state to end the conflicts, and the Arab Muslims refusing this and instead waging war, the UN set up an explicit fund to support the Arab refugees, the first and still the only fund of its kind being explicitly for refugees of only one nation or race of people, This is called UNRWA, the United Nations Relief Work Agency for Palestinians. But, to this day, the UN have yet to provide any kind of support or funding to the more than double amount of Jewish refugees who became refugees during and directly after the war due to the war. Despite a number of false claims being made today, the Palestinian Arabs after the 1948 war at this time in the regions of Gaza and the West Bank were not occupied by Israel, and nor did they have their own sovereign country in these areas. Many of the Palestinian Arabs did move to live in these areas as a result of the war and displacements, but they did not hold control. Gaza was controlled by Egypt's military, and the West Bank was controlled by Jordan. You would think, as the Egyptians and Jordanians supported the Palestinian Arabs against the Jews and the State of Israel, surely they now help the Palestinian people prosper, right? This assumption actually brings into question the objectives of Egypt and Jordan when they joined the war against Israel. Whether they did it to support independence for the Palestinians of the whole land and supporting the Palestinians' welfare, or if they had alternative motives. The Egyptians kept occupancy over Palestinians in Gaza. They refused the majority of refugees from entering into Egypt, refused them all Egyptian citizenship, and refused most of them the right to work in Egypt. Not only this, but in later years they disbanded the all-Palestinian government that led the people in Gaza and denied them the freedom of possible democracy. More so on account of the Palestinian leading factions in Gaza supported the Islamic extremists in Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood, which brought violence, civil unrest, and death to many Egyptians. Jordan, on the other hand, initially allowed refugees to become citizens of Jordan. However, due to the extreme ideologies presented by the leading Palestinian factions in those regions, mainly the PFLP and the PLA, Jordan eventually kept the majority mostly locked in the West Bank regions. Later in time, this relationship got worse, which also resulted in a huge amount of civil unrest, violence, and death in Jordan. After the first full-scale war of 1948, since Israel was now returned as a sovereign Jewish state, there were 3 more wars that followed. Based on a lot of the global media, it is easy to be convinced that Israel must have instigated these wars. It's a matter of perspective, but in reality, it's a very hard claim to make. The next war that followed was the Suez Canal crisis. In 1956, Egypt decided to nationalize the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal is in essence a river which flows from the Red Sea through the northeast of Egypt to the Mediterranean Sea. It is the only direct passage by water for all of the Middle East to the West and Northern Hemisphere. It allows materials and supplies to be delivered between these regions of the world. It is a passage which many nations use, and that included Israel, as it was the most direct way for the southeast of Israel to gain supplies to help build and nurture their communities. Egypt did not just nationalize the canal to put them in complete control of it, but they also sent their military to take control and blockaded it to prevent Israel having passage through. Israel asked them to remove the blockade and their military, calling it a declaration of war if they do not allow passage, but Egypt refused. As such, Israel's military marched south and entered Egypt in an attempt to remove the blockade. Britain and France also joined Israel in looking to remove the blockade, as they also viewed it as a war-inviting act, as it gave dictated control by Egypt of the import and exports between the rest of the Middle East and the Northern Hemisphere. By Israel going south, this meant they went past Gaza and so took temporary occupation. Fighting broke out along the canal, and the UN soon got involved, ordering Egypt to remove their blockade and remove the military from the canal. Egypt conceded, and so the forces of Israel along with Britain and France also retreated. This all lasted, including Israel's occupation of Gaza, for around a week. Israel handed occupancy of Gaza back to Egypt, and the status quo of the region remained, whereby Israel being a sovereign Jewish state, and the regions of Gaza and the West Bank remained under the control of Egypt and Jordan, with no further land being taken or given to or from any side. This remained the case up until the next war.